I bequeath all my movable and immovable property, including bank accounts and safe deposit boxes, the mansion and land in the Doyneville estate, as well as a controlling stake in my company Blackwood Motors to my only son Stephen Blackwood. To my second wife Elizabeth Blackwood, I bequeath a house on Filland Street in Little Rock and assign a monthly allowance of $3,000, Mr. Kendall, the notary, finished reading the will. A smug smile spread across Stephen's face. He ran his hand through his well-groomed brown hair and crossed his legs. The man turned his head slightly towards his stepmother. Elizabeth, who was only 10 years older than her stepson, sat stunned by this decision of her late husband John. Tears froze in her eyes, and her cheeks were flushed with resentment and anger. She couldn't contain her feelings and jumped up from her chair. "So you're saying, Mr. Kendall, that John left all the property to this one?" She pointed to John's son. "Fie, Elizabeth, I thought that after so many years of living with my fathers, all your habits would disappear, but no." Stephen grimaced. "I don't agree with the will," Elizabeth continued. "If one of you does not agree with the will and will of the deceased, you can appeal it in court. My mission is over. Goodbye." "Thank you very much." Stephen stood up and extended his hand to Mr. Kendall. "You have served my father faithfully for a very long time." "That's my job, Mr. Blackwood. Goodbye." The notary could not understand such a decision of the deceased either. John invited him just 2 weeks before his death and changed his will. Before that, it was exactly the opposite, and Mr. Kendall understood his client. He didn't like Stephen, and there were good reasons for that, but he has no right to take sides. When the notary disappeared through the door, Elizabeth turned to her stepson, then hurried after Mr. Kendall. "I won't leave it like this. I will achieve my goal." Well, it's time for you to pack your suitcase, Elizabeth," Stephen replied sarcastically. Mr. Kendall. Elise caught up with the notary at the car. "Could I hire you to help me in contesting the will? You, like no one else, know our family, please." "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood, come to me on Monday and we will discuss everything. I don't understand John's decision myself. He was clearly not himself when he changed his will." "Until Monday." "Thank you very much." Steve was standing at the second-floor window and saw his stepmother talking to the notary. "That's a bitch, but she really can get a will change. What right does she even have to claim all this? Who is she? Nobody. And he's the only son." Anger boiled up inside Steve. He had already emptied the third glass of whiskey and decided to fill another one. Elizabeth's footsteps sounded in the hallway behind him. "What, Liz, the plan didn't work out?" Elizabeth froze in the hallway. "What do you mean, Steve?" "What I mean," the language was already beginning to slur. Stephen turned around and glared at his stepmother. "You've been working on my father all these years, doing everything to distance him from me. Did you want to grab everything for yourself? Didn't work out? What are you talking about? You yourself did not communicate with your father, you constantly contradicted him, swore with him, and when he was ill all these 2 years." Elizabeth's cheeks burned with indignation. She despised her stepson. "What am I talking about? You persuaded my father to send me to hell in the middle of nowhere to study. Did you care about my education? The fuck is complete, you can tell it to someone else." Stephen's voice began to rise. "In your opinion, the best university in London is a damn piece of cake, ungrateful. If your father and I hadn't sent you there, you would have been drunk long ago. You spent whole days doing nothing but drinking, walking, getting into trouble, from which your father was tired of pulling you out. And studying didn't help you. What did you do for 2 years when you came back? Dad was hoping to hand over the management of the company to you, and you've ruined his hopes. You didn't even talk to him when he was sick all this time. Didn't you help him get sick? My father has always been a strong man, and then, while I was studying away from home, he suddenly fell ill with an incurable disease. This seems very suspicious. It's worth hinting about it to the police. Are you completely crazy? If I hadn't taken care of him, supported him, he would have died 2 years ago." Elizabeth was hurt to hear such words. "You still cry? I think you even have a lot of what he left you. I should have persuaded him not to leave you anything, you sentimental old fool." Stephen could no longer figure out what to say and what to keep quiet about. "Elizabeth, on the other hand, seized the opportunity to get everything out of her stepson, and imperceptibly turned on the dictaphone on the phone while Stephen was topping up his whiskey in a glass. But you can return to your old profession, although you are already too old for a prostitute. What do you mean, persuade? Elizabeth decided not to focus on Steve's insults, but to get more information out of him. Do you think I would calmly watch you turn my father against me? Did you think to grab everything? It cost me 2 weeks to pretend to be a loving and repentant son, and voila, the father is ready for anything. And the pictures with your lover finally convinced the old fool to change the will. Elizabeth couldn't say a word, she was so shocked that everything seemed like a nightmare to her. Steve, noticing her bewilderment, laughed. Photoshop works wonders. I knew that my father would not believe my words, so I had to slip fake photos. Oh, you bastard. Elizabeth began to cry. It was terrible for her to think that her late husband, before his death, considered her a traitor when she sincerely loved him and did not attach. Why didn't he show her anything? She would have been able to prove her innocence and expose her stepson. And how much it cost me to dissuade my father from talking about this topic. You could have persuaded him. It's great that he leaned back so quickly. Steve raised his glass of whiskey. To you, Dad. You too, idiot. I've been swapping his medications for vitamins all these 2 weeks. I'm tired of waiting. You're a monster. Elizabeth was shocked by what she heard. How could he kill his own father? Mother, it's time for you to pack your bags and get out of my house. I don't want to see your face, it makes me sick. The tongue finally stopped obeying and slurred. I'll put you in jail. You'll go to jail, Elizabeth said angrily. Who will believe you? And besides, I have so much money now that I can hire the best lawyers for myself. And you have nothing, just your words. Go get your stuff. You're wrong, there is something. Elizabeth went up to her stepson and slapped him in the face, turned around and moved towards her bedroom. And only now it dawned on Stephen's alcohol-clouded brain that he had told too much, and it could all be used against him. This bitch could get her way. The notary, her father's doctors, acquaintances, would surely take her side. What an idiot I am. We have to stop her. Stephen staggered into his stepmother's bedroom. Elizabeth was packing her bags in a hurry. She went to the dresser and picked up the jewelry box. Stephen jumped up to her and took her away. Leave it, you will leave here with what you came with. Is that clear? But first, tell me, what do you have on me? What can you prove? Just empty words. Let me go. Stephen grabbed the woman's arm painfully, leaving red marks. Let go, you bastard. I will prove that you killed your father. I'll prove it. Everyone will know what you really are. And you'll go to jail and be left with nothing. You're not even worthy of your father's last name. Stephen could not stand it and slapped his stepmother with all his might. The woman could not resist and fell, clutching her face. Tears flowed from his eyes, his cheek burned with fire, a bruise was swelling on his arm. But worst of all, her phone fell out of her pocket. Elizabeth wanted to grab it, but Stephen beat her to it. Voice recorder. His face was distorted by a grimace of anger and hatred. Oh, you lousy creature. Have you been recording all this time? Stephen threw the phone on the floor, then shattered. The stepson rushed at the stepmother. His hand squeezed the neck of the poor woman and pressed with such force that the vertebrae were ready to crack. Elizabeth wheezed, scratched and fought back, but soon she stopped moving. Stephen kicked the unconscious body of his stepmother, spat and went to the office for another shot of whiskey. Dog death. After several doses of alcohol, Stephen passed out in a chair. The man woke up from a terrible headache and nausea. Rubbing his temples, he headed towards the bar, for a new portion of alcohol. And only after a glass of whiskey, he remembered about the quarrel with his stepmother. Elizabeth. Stephen called, then walked unsteadily towards her bedroom. The woman was still lying on the floor, next to a broken phone, a packed suitcase and an open jewelry box. Stephen felt sick. He made an effort. It was necessary to do something, to get rid of the body somehow. It was already dark outside. It was 22:30. Stephen, under the cover of darkness, decided to bury the body and a suitcase with things on the outskirts of their land plot. They just recently dug up the ground before winter, and the approaching rain will do the rest. It's good that Elizabeth didn't have a car, she never learned to drive, she was afraid. Otherwise, I would have to put the car somewhere else. While the man was throwing earth over the body, it began to rain with a thunderstorm, lightning illuminated a terrible place. Its glimpses were reflected in the eyes of the deceased. For a minute Stephen froze in horror and looked at the body of his stepmother. It seemed to him that she was still alive, as if she blinked. Lightning flashed again, distorting the expression of the dead face. Yes, did she blink or not? No way. She's dead. Yes. She has marks on her neck, a blue face, an open mouth, she's definitely dead. But, driven by fear, Stephen began to throw earth faster into a fresh grave. Exhausted, tired, covered in mud and clay, he returned to the house, entered from the back in trance so as not to leave traces on the carpet, undressed and went upstairs to take a shower. All the servants are due to arrive only on Monday, so he still has time to examine everything and get rid of all the remaining evidence. Saturday morning burst into the bedroom with freshness and coolness. Stephen got out of bed and first of all looked out the window, looking in the direction where he had buried Elizabeth's body yesterday. The rain really washed away all traces. Having calmed down, Stephen began to eliminate the evidence to the end. He washed his dirty clothes, wiped the floors and stairs at the back in trance, examined Elizabeth's room. He decided to hide the jewelry box. He's not a fool to bury them together with the body, and then sell them somewhere in the neighboring town to a pawnshop. Finally making sure that everything was clean and tidy, Stephen decided to throw a party, calling his friends. And I don't care that his father died just a few days ago. He had been waiting for this for so long and now he has waited for it, freedom, money, power. He hired a servant for the weekend, he does not need permanent workers here yet, ordered food at a restaurant and invited friends. The party was such that it could be heard several miles away from the mansion. "Hey, buddy, where's your stepmother?" Robert asked Stephen. "What do you want?" "She's gone." Steve tensed. Why would his friend know about his stepmother? "Let's have fun." In the middle of the night, when all the guests were asleep, Stephen woke up from a parched throat, went to the table by the window and poured water. The full moon was shining outside the window, the sky was clear after another rain with a thunderstorm. Stephen heard a strange sound, the sound of squelching mud. It seemed that someone was walking through the mud. Stephen looked out of the window, and in the distance a dark figure was walking across his land towards the house. Stephen took a closer look, and the glass fell out of his hand. Elizabeth, she was walking towards the house. So she was definitely alive and now she got out. Now she will surely put him in jail and take everything for herself. He mustn't let that happen. Stephen rushed down to the back entrance. I jumped out into the street and began to look around, but there was no one. She noticed me or heard me and decided to hide. She's not going to make it. Stephen walked around the house, checked the front door, then began to inspect the ground. Footprints, there were many footprints, they were left by him and could have been left by hired servants. Stephen was terrified that Elizabeth, if alive, would hand him over to the police, would tell everything. He couldn't let that happen. Could not. In the morning, Steve woke up to a noise coming from the living room downstairs. These are his friends who have already got up and decided to improve their health with a new portion of alcohol, while waiting for the owner of the house. Stephen threw back the blanket, all his feet were in mud, there were mud, stained clothes and slippers lying near the bed, and dirty footprints led to the bed itself. He hurriedly began to clean up everything, crumpled up his clothes and put them in the closet, then he would sort it out. He himself went down to his friends to continue the fun. So another day passed. In the middle of the night, one of the guests, Bobby, got up to use the toilet, after which he decided to open the window and let some fresh air into the room. Going to the window, he saw a figure moving away from the house into the distance across the field. Bobby took a closer look and recognized Stephen's figure. Bobby opened the window and just wanted to shout, but changed his mind. Maybe Stephen is a sleepwalker and walks in his sleep, but you can't scare and call them. Bobby decided to wait. After a while Stephen's figure appeared in the distance and headed towards the house. Then there were footsteps on the stairs and along the corridor. The door of Stephen's room slammed. Bobby calmed down that everything was fine with his friend, and he was at home, and went to bed. Stephen, in the morning, was horrified to find dirt on his feet again, pajamas, and even his hands were covered in dirt. What is going on? He doesn't remember any of this at all. How did it happen? He only remembers the party, it seems he is. Sure enough, last night, when he was downstairs with Roger and everyone else had gone to bed, he thought he heard squelching footsteps in the mud again. But Roger didn't hear anything. And the dirt? Did he go outside again? He didn't remember that. After taking a shower and changing clothes, Stephen went out into the corridor, where a hired maid was cleaning the carpets from dirt. The maid glanced at Stephen as if he were crazy. What are you staring at? Work, that's what you get paid for. Stephen snapped, although in fact he was afraid. He was afraid that these traces would give himself away. He was afraid that Elizabeth was still alive and hiding somewhere, waiting for the moment. Because he did not remember at all how he went somewhere at night. Don't go in the middle of the day and check the body on the spot or not. And if she got out, comes to her senses somewhere, and then gains strength and goes to the police? We need to drink and calm down. And Stephen drank so much that it could calm several people. But anxious thoughts and fear did not let the man go. He often looked out of the window and listened. The ringing of the phone startled Stephen. He picked up the phone. Mr. Kendall was on the other end of the line. Hello, Stephen, I can talk to Elizabeth. Her phone is not available. And she's not here, she left, Stephen said, slurring his tongue, right after you. She took her things, jewelry, and drove away. And where? Should I care? Just because she's been sleeping with my dad all these years doesn't mean I have to worry about her. She's nobody to me. How can you say that? She raised you from the age of 10. She replaced your mother. That's enough. I don't care where this idiot went, probably to celebrate the death of my beloved dad. If you need it, then look for it yourself. Stephen hung up. Why did this Kendall call right now? Does he suspect something? What if he comes here looking for Elizabeth? There are also these steps under the windows around the house. Obviously not everything is so simple here. This tenacious reptile was able to survive and fool him. And at the right moment to appear on the doorstep and tell everything, open his filthy mouth. Stephen squeezed his eyes shut, his head hurt terribly, and these friends, along with the noisy party, began to bother. They also showed up, of course. He's got money now, so why don't they get drunk for free? Freeloaders. In order not to snap at friends and not to blurt out too much, Stephen went up to his room and fell on the bed. He heard a knock on the door. The sun was shining. Stephen went to the front door and opened it. Mr. Kendall, the police, and Elizabeth were standing in the doorway. She was smiling triumphantly. Mr. Blackwood, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of your father and the attempted murder of Elizabeth Blackwood. You will go to jail for life, and your property, or rather your father's, goes entirely to Mrs. Elizabeth Blackwood. Stephen woke up in a cold sweat. It was night. He dreamed it all, dreamed it. What if it all turns out to be true? What then? Stephen stood up resolutely from the bed. Roger, Bobby, and Robert were the first to wake up. They went downstairs, intending to improve their health. Along the way, we discussed how lucky Stephen was with the inheritance. When they entered the living room, they froze in horror. Elizabeth, or rather Elizabeth's body, was sitting on the sofa in the middle of the living room. She was obviously dead, and for a long time. Her whole body and clothes were wet and muddy. Dirty water was running down her hair, forming a dirty puddle on the sofa and the floor at her feet. The eyes were wide open, pulled up by a veil. There was dirt in one of them. The face had a blue hue, the mouth was slightly open, the tip of a swollen black tongue was visible, cadaverous spots were visible on the body, and a terrible smell was coming from the body itself. Roger felt sick and threw up right on the carpet. The guys stood and looked at the body in horror. Dirty footprints were coming from the body, which led to the back door. Here are friends, this is my beloved stepmother Elizabeth. Stephen was standing near the table and pouring himself a whiskey into a glass. His clothes were all dirty, his hands were also dirty. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were red from long alcohol consumption, sleepless nights. What about Liz? You wanted to say something, didn't you? Yes? Did you want to put me away? Well, speak up, my friends are listening carefully. The three friends were afraid to say a word. Stephen was clearly crazy, anything could be expected from him. Stephen, what's going on? I tried to reason with Bobby's friend. Bobby, this lady has been hanging around the house all these days. I saw and heard her. I had to go every night and check if she was there or not. I couldn't sleep properly because of her. Check where? And why are you covered in clay? How where? In the ground. I had to dig her up every time and check whether she was there or she managed to escape. And so, I'm sick of it all. If she wants to say something like that, let her say it, I don't care. Come on, Liz, why aren't you talking? Have you swallowed your tongue? Stephen roared with terrible laughter. Friends also shivered. Robert quietly left the living room and called the police and an ambulance. Stephen was accused of murder, but due to a clouding of his mind, he was sent for compulsory treatment. Mr. Kendall took custody of him. After treatment, Stephen was placed in an elite home for the insane for the rest of his days. The inheritance he received allowed him to do this. How are you today, Stephen? The attending physician asked. Thanks, Doc, fine. I'm at peace now. Now no one will take my money.